Well, it is truly an honor to be here today to speak to you. I'm Dr. Payal Bhandari. I'm basically a board-certified family physician practicing in San Francisco for over 12 years. And I've, over the last 4 years, have really moved my practice to be much more holistic. I do specialize in a plant-based diet. Before I start, though, I want to take a poll. How many of you are already dairy-free? Wow, you're going to make my job really easy. How many of you are here just because you're interested in what people have to say? There's a lot of great free food. Okay. Well, I'm going to start this talk more as talking as a mom and how it's led to the work that I do. About 8 years ago, my family's life changed overnight. Our almost 6-year-old daughter all of a sudden developed severe abdominal pain. And within 24 hours, we learned she had a large ovarian mass. And so, whenever all of a sudden she's got to get her ovary taken out. And the surgeons, the other doctors told us, well, this is just it's congenital. It's like she was born with this and it just kind of happened. And I thought, wow, am I going to spend the rest of my life wondering why did this happen? Because is this going to impact her other ovary? Is this going to impact my other daughter? And having not found the answers from asking many different physicians, like some of the top surgeons in the city, I went on a search to figure out, I want to know why. And if I'm curious as to why, that means that there's so many other things that are happening that people are either they're saying, well, I guess this is genetics, or I was born with this and I have to live with this. But there's no way that I can teach my daughter that you're just going to have to live with this. And so that led me to the journey that is the work I do today, which is I ended up learning that her ovarian mass was directly caused by dairy consumption. And so I had to figure out, why is this? So let's go back to I was born in the 70s where dairy was hugely promoted. I grew up drinking 3 glasses of milk, cottage cheese, pizzas, you name it. And this was considered to be, it was like that's what you do. And I didn't realize if I had any health issues that it was tied to what I associated with this is healthy. And then I grew up where probably when I entered medical school, we had a huge campaign about, from the Dairy Council about, 3 glasses of milk, and you have a lot of celebrities promoting this, and you're associating people that you respect with this is what we should be doing. And as a physician, or at medical school, our education in nutrition is really minuscule. I mean, we know basically what every layperson knows. And so, at that time, I started recognizing that there was an actual shift that's really impacted what we all believe. So back in the 1950s, 60s, there was actually the FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration, and the Dairy Council. They came together, and their job is really to protect industry. And so there was a huge campaigns that were going out, where that also tied into the food pyramid that all children have been taught, both in our generation, our parents' generation, where it wasn't represented by nutritionists, by physicians. It was really represented by industry. And when it's promoted in our schools, it's promoted in every aspect. When we go to the hospitals, we go to our doctor's office, that's what we believe. So at the same time, there was an actual huge 20-year study called the China study that was done. And it actually demonstrated that when you take certain regions that have never had any dairy products, or even certain, they didn't even have high consumption of animal protein. And then they introduced, they did controlled studies where they introduced dairy, for example. Within a year, they saw a dramatic spike in stomach cancer in those populations. Or they saw a huge spike in hospitalization. And then when, for economic reasons, like there were times in certain countries where they literally couldn't have those products because they didn't have the resources, there were shifts. They saw within a year, the hospitalizations, the morbidities and health issues drastically dropped. So it's like, this isn't coincidental, it's a 20-year study. And so, having done a lot more research at this point to understand what is it, why is this happening? The simplest way that I have you think about it is that 99% of not absorbable, how does your body react? It says, this is a toxin. Like, I can't break this down. Now, it's going to try and reject it. So it may initially cause you to like bring it back up, and you might feel like you're having a little bit of mucus, or your nose is a bit stuffy, or you're kind of like, I can't breathe properly. You may have heartburn. Kids, like babies, when you usually introduce it, it's typically around 12 months. They may be more yapping, they may be spitting up more. Something's happening. But if you're continuously introducing something, that reaction can't be as strong. And the other thing, it's very confusing. So if you imagine as a mother, and I'm giving my daughters, lots of milk products, as I've been told, you gotta give like so much milk. And I'm smiling and cheering, and she's looking at me saying, well, my mom thinks this is a good thing to do. I don't feel really good. It creates a confusion in our mind. So what happens is that you do feel something, you just start to not trust what you're feeling because you're trained a certain way. Inside the body, what happens when you don't absorb something, after a while, the digestive system is breaking down, right? Because you can't absorb that nutrient. It's not just calcium, it's a bunch of the other proteins. So when something's not absorbed, the stomach integrity actually gets weaker. And the stomach, right beside it is the small intestine. It really can't break down those foods, and it's trying to reject it. So it has a hard time absorbing nutrients. So the whole system starts getting weaker. Now, when the digestive system is now compromised, it impacts us systemically. And so it creates an inflammatory response. So if we want to talk from our children, one of the number one reasons, you see a lot of children now have glasses at a young age, you see a lot of learning disorders, it's tied to the quality of the blood flow. So if you have a systemic inflammatory reaction, what's happened is there's calcification, right? So you hear about cardiovascular disease, right? You hear the word calcification. A lot of studies we use is we do calcium scores to understand calcification. Well, calcification, calcium, right? And that's primary through a dairy source. And so what happens is that this pathology is actually starting right from the beginning. Because do we really think about these trends that started when we were little? They are going on, and that when you're finally symptomatic, you're much older. So you didn't put the two and two together, because psychologically it doesn't make any sense. We promoted something to be like this beautiful, nurturing item that our parents are giving to us with love. But inside our body, it really is not absorbable. So it creates a high level of systemic inflammation. And so in our young children, we do see we see a lot of pathology in terms of, dairy is not just dairy. You're combining it, oftentimes, it's mixed in with sugar and eggs, breads, right? In terms of, it's such a huge ingredient in many of our products. So because you're not getting the nourishment you need, because there's no real nutrients that you can absorb, you keep craving. You're like, I need something. So you crave the same thing that you associate as a positive item. But it creates this negative feedback loop. And so going back to what happened to my daughter, we gave her a ton of dairy. I grew up, and my husband grew up having tons of dairy. And we only correlated with the moments that she had gotten sick had only to do with that she had a high consumption of dairy. Right? And that means it's a little tricky, because when you have a glass of milk, you feel one way. When you have cheese, you feel another way. So you get really confused. And we realized that over time, she was born with an ovarian cyst. But we now know that a lot of these growths, so if you think about back to what I was saying, is that if you can't absorb something, your immune system is having an intense inflammatory reaction. It goes from malnourished cells to, you're going to have basically cells that are growing really fast. So cysts can form, cancers can form, but when you're younger, something is going on. So with her, she happened to grow cysts that kept growing and growing to the point where the ovary got twisted and couldn't get any blood flow, so it died. Now that I specialize in this, what I've learned is that when we see in our younger children, when they're becoming teens, one of the bigger pathologies, you see a lot of kids now have tons of acne, right? It's not just dairy, it's all the sugar that they're having, but they come together. One thing is not, you can't look at everything as just a one component. It's very interconnected. We also see our young girls are having their cycles much earlier. Now it's very common for a young girl to have her menstrual cycle esophagitis. And typically, that's when you have like heartburn issues that creates an inflammatory state. And this gentleman has been told that you've got to drink a ton of milk. But what the milk is doing is pulling the calcium off his bones. So he's creating an environment for cancer cells to grow, right? And he's also causing the bones to not be as strong. So it creates basically an inflammatory response. And there's tons of studies that have shown it, and we clearly see people's lives dramatically shift by just taking this one component out. So I think that's one way you want to think about it, is just in terms of if you can't absorb it, what's the reaction that's going to happen inside your body? The other thing that I want to bring into awareness is just in terms of today's world. We all are aware there's a high level of pollution, worldwide, and the world is really small. Now, there's high levels in pollution, high levels of arsenic, cadmium, lead. All of this settles into our waterways, into our soil. So what's happening is that the animals are now having high levels of arsenic, cadmium, lead poisoning, right? And irrelevant of something being organic or cage-free or however you want to label it, it's in the soil. So we have now clear-cut long-term studies that have shown a lot of these animals are actually having tumors and high levels of these toxic exposures. They are directly passed to people. So, but that's not something that we have in the United States. We don't regulate that. And it doesn't matter if that's the case. It's that it's got to just get passed through. So there's very poor regulation because the Food and Drug Administration's job is to protect industry. It's really not to protect us. It is what it is. So now, going to, let's say, if you wanted to talk about the toxin exposure conversation, which is that when you have dairy and you can't absorb it, the challenge is you can't clear the toxins out, right? And we now, it was a great study released back in October of 2016, which demonstrated when you are exposed to a toxin, it stays in your blood for at least a minimum of 8.5 years. So we're all exposed to it, right? And that's always been that way. The difference, though, now is that our eating habits are not allowing us to clear the stuff out. So our systems are just breaking down, right? So arsenic, for example, is at high correlation in dairy consumption. And arsenic is like rat poison. So what happens here is they've also looked at saying, well, what's the most effective way? Like, let's say you take this out. Well, we've all been exposed in different ways, right? The most effective way to pull these toxins out is basically through green vegetables, right? Because you got to poop it out. I mean, peeing and sweating is great, but you have to have the bowel movement. So what they are finding is that with dairy specifically, the arsenic levels are really high. So we look at our vegetarian client, our patients, and they are like, well, I've never had any meat, but they still have a lot of dairy in their diet. I've often found in all of my patients that are vegetarian, their arsenic levels are very high, and they're not really clearing it out. So I think just in the awareness that today's world has changed, and the food industry is an industry. It's not what we imagine, it's not what we market. We market an image of wow, it must be this beautiful farm, these animals are grazing, and they're really loved. That's not, it is still what it is, right? And I think it's a level of awareness of just then, if you know, what can you do about it? So I think that's the two big things I would think about in terms of, one, that calcium is not absorbable. So it actually, in our children, we do know that it increases bone lengthening. So you do see, when you talk about, when people say, I drank a ton of milk and I'm really tall. Yes, that is true because it causes this rapid growth of cells, right? So that the bones do lengthen. But the other thing, though, is the bone quality is very poor. So you hear about, in our older generation, we talk about osteoporosis, and they're all about your bone density. That's only one factor. We can't measure bone quality. So the quality, the integrity, isn't that strong. And so what's happening is, yes, we do in some individuals, we see bone lengthening, so some people are very tall, but the strength is not very strong. And what happens inside the body, our regulating system gets disturbed. So what's happening is you're consuming something you can't absorb, right? So your body says, I gotta correct this. So it pulls the calcium off the bones, right? It impacts your magnesium, all your other electrolytes. When those things get off, right, you feel a deficit, so you're gonna go to having a sugar item. So when you show it, and the ad before about Coca-Cola and sugar, right? It's that we can expand this topic to not just dairy. But what we're doing is that by creating this awareness, and creating this shift, it creates a positive change of that when we are promoting something in our school systems, for example, that clearly our own children, none of that can absorb it. We are setting them up for an environment where they can't focus, right? And what are we giving them after that? We're giving them like these frozen meals, we're giving them like chips, a lot of sugar-coated protein bars, and other items. And so we're impacting our children's ability to learn and be focused, right? So, I mean, that's kind of more on the medical side, right? And you can go into, I think people often hear, some people do get turned off on the environmental impact, right? So I won't go into that. But I think honestly, it's more of that, the two things I want you to take away is that the actual calcium is not absorbable, and it actually is set up, it's one of the biggest causes for coronary artery disease that we see now in the United States and worldwide is starting at the age of like 8 and younger, right? You also see a drastic spike in our overweight to obesity rate. We have basically, at this point, we're pretty close to every other person in the United States is overweight to obese. And even if you're not in the overweight to obesity category, it doesn't mean you don't have things going on, because we have many people that we're increasing our rates of type 1 and type 2 diabetes, our cancer rates, where people are really now can sit in a room and can raise their hands and say, how many of you know somebody or yourself has had this pathology or this pathology? If you go back to your grandparents era, they would have been like, we didn't really know people that had these things. So instead of accepting that pathology is normal, let's turn it around. And a lot of it is just awareness, because the awareness allows you to maybe just for that moment think about it. And just imagine, not just the experience when you just taste something, the experience is way beyond. And it really impacts your emotional well-being. Because the other thing is that, when you go back to the description I gave about the guts, right, when you can't absorb something and there's this inflammatory response, do remember is that the majority of the chemicals that help you be happy, help you be focused, are produced right here. They're not produced all here. When you think about serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, right? When you don't feel right here, and you have a gut instinct, but you can't put your finger on what it was, then you're going to keep doing that. So if you're just changing our outlook, just feeling like light and able to just have true clarity, right? It just starts on that level. It's you're gonna, and it's feeling. You got to do this enough times to know that, like, is this really the right course? Because maybe many of you are already convinced that it's a good idea to be dairy-free or to be vegan. But when we step out of this room, that is still not the mainstream. And it is really hard to accept, because most physicians, like myself, 10 years ago, I promoted 3 glasses of milk a day because that's what I was told. And that's when we look at the new food pyramid, it still has, like the one that was promoted now from the Obama administration that you see on a lot of labels, it has a glass of milk. It's hard to go against that, because your instincts and what everybody says is different. But I will tell you, this is the 2 big things are you can't absorb it, and it really is a setup for cardiovascular disease and all the hormonal issues that we see, along with vision issues to neurological issues, and then you have a high exposure to toxins which you just can't clear, and it just doesn't make you feel very good. So, anyways, I will leave the rest of the time if you guys have any questions or feedback.
I imagine that given the knowledge that you have about this, when patients come in day out, and their food is effectively harming them and getting them closer to their death, it must just drive me insane and crazy that there's all these misconceptions out there. And so I expect trying to get them to understand that there's a different reality here and they can improve their health with their food. What are the most effective ways you have found to create awareness in your patients? What do you tell them to do, or to read, or to absorb, to be able to shift their mindset?
It is really about the words we use, and it's about connecting what they're experiencing with what's physically happening to them and empowering them to give them tools. So I look at that challenge as an amazing experience to make a difference in that person's life. And so each person is unique. And so let's say that, each person comes in with something, right? Like, for example, let's talk about asthma. Right? How many times do you go in a school system and every third or fifth kid has asthma? And the only treatment option that's given is a bunch of inhalers, or maybe dust mite control, or, and you're thinking, it's our diet. And the number one cause of asthma is literally dairy, because you're literally choking and you can't breathe. And your life is completely negatively impacted. And for a kid who can't run anymore, and they now suddenly become a bookworm, and that's what's valued, which is great, but there's something inside. And so it's about connecting to that person. There's something that they're not saying, but you have to feel it. And so it's about actually, when you do, there's a true art to a physical exam. And you learn so much by just really understanding what's not just on the skin, but what's going on when you feel a pulse, when you take a blood pressure, when you listen to a heart, when you feel a liver enlarged. And when someone recognizes, hey, maybe I'm not as okay. Like, I do feel something, but I just kind of let it go. And what it is about, I use positive language, where it's about, here's just how we're going to turn things a little around. So for example, instead of saying, oh, we're going to have a glass of milk, you're just pulling something straight out of the fridge and drinking it. You're just this automatic reflex behavior. It's like, that's not what you crave. We all crave this, a hot meal. We crave having a moment to, eat something. So let's bring that experience. And when people are able to connect something positive, and then at the same time, the recommendation happens to not include some of these items, right? Their focus has shifted because it doesn't feel like a deprivation. Oh, I can't do any of these things. If I focus that way, it's really stressful. So if I turn it around, I say, look, you're here, you're motivated. You drink water, or you drink something, you eat something. So why don't I make sure those cells are nourished? If you feel like you're thriving, you're going to want more of that, right? And there is a part of helping when you bring the topic of arsenic poisoning, and I do check the blood, because the blood, when they see what the pathology is, because I don't wait for pathology to be at a severe level. I'm very proactive. When you see that, wow, I had no idea. And she felt it, and it's there. Like, my hands are kind of cold. And I'm just used to my hands being cold. It's like, you've got cardiovascular disease. You've got high levels of toxins. Then, people do wake up, and they say, what can I do about it? So it's really about empowering them. They are the drivers of it. And that it's okay that, you're going to have this or that. But over time, because you're feeling better, and you do an experiment, and you notice the clear-cut difference within days, it changes all of us.
I don't actually hear a question. Sure. And then you can probably not answer everything if you want. So with our campaign, two of the things that we've found really important and why dairy needs to be a focus is the question of hormones in milk and lactose intolerance. And the thing is that
that they're organic. So you're focused on, well, they didn't get this ingested. But you're also making an assumption that the animals are eating, and like, well, they're all like getting grass. Well, the grass is like the soil has a ton of arsenic in it, right? So you're having this imagine this view of like, well, if they don't get any hormones, it's great. There is a bigger piece to this, which is that they're also not treated that great, right? That really impacts the milk they produce, right? The soil is really rich in a lot of these toxins, and that is being ingested in the animals. And there's an assumption of like these animals are really all healthy and they're going to live a long life. That is not the world we live in. Even if they're on, you know, when you're thinking a dairy farm and it's great out there, no, it's still an industry. And so I think that the missing piece, irrelevant of just the hormones, is actually those animals are not all eating grass their entire lives, right? Yeah, it might be part of what they're having, but they're also having actual crops, right? Like most of these animals are like supposed to eat like vegetables and grass, but we need to produce a lot of milk for these guys, right? So we're going to give them whatever it takes to pump them up, and they're getting like corn and other things which they cannot digest. Those animals are not actually being nurtured, right? And so that's then the milk that they produce, and that is being passed on. So it's not as clean as it's assumed. So I think it's more of like go beyond to be like it's really these children's arsenic levels, cadmium levels are very, very high. That's one big thing. I think in terms of the lactose intolerance, it gets tricky because there are then, you know, people of like, let's say European, like Caucasians say, well, we're fine. But honestly, we've done extensive studies that say 99+% of people, they cannot break down many of the products. So it's not just lactose. It's, again, it looks like a very singular way to say, oh, milk is only about protein, and it's only about calcium, and it's only about lactose. It's a pretty complex entity. So
Yeah, I actually meant to say liquid calories and then I
yeah,
said
it's much more than that. And if you want to look at it very broadly, then I would say, you know, that's really what people are being impacted by, is look at it in a very holistic manner. Right? Yeah.
Have there been any studies about children who consume dairy products and their major anxiety levels?
It's very high.
Okay.
Yeah. Because here's this, going back to what I was saying, when you have something and you literally cannot absorb it, then your cells are being malnourished because it sets up an entire setup for trouble. So let's say, you know, I have, you know, a glass of milk, right? Now, I could then have a big salad, right? And another like sauteed vegetables. But this was the thing that my body was like, this is not safe. So it creates an inflammatory response. All this energy, right? All these nutrients is part of the heart and soul of the immune system. It's going there and it's going to fight that, right? And then what happens is that, you know, the other component is digestive enzymes, right? You have to have many enzymes to break food down. You have to have them in your mouth, in your stomach, your small intestines. Now, if you've got a war zone going on, you aren't going to produce over time enough digestive enzymes, so you can't break food down. So then what happens is you feel something's off. Your cells are not getting nourished. You're really uncomfortable. There's a major inflammatory response going on. So you're feeling something. You're scared. You can't focus, right? But how do you say anything about it? Because it doesn't make any sense. So it really does clearly impact your ability to really think clearly, to actually be very calm. And it's very clearly shown that it would dramatically improve from our children's learning disabilities that we see, from even, you know, when you hear about like autism and you hear about infertility issues to, I mean, you name it. It has a direct correlation to people's diet. And the challenge is that it's really getting passed on to generations. So when you talk about genes, it's not that our gene pools are drastically changing, but our eating habits, these things have actually changed very, very quickly. So yeah, it just for even if you want to have a happy kid and you take dairy out, it's worth it. I I mean, I'm only saying that for my two girls. They're very different. Where one could never got sick unless she had like way too much dairy, and only then she'd like get sick. But the happiest kid, the other one, the minute it was introduced, it's like diarrhea. The mood is up, and you don't know what to do, right? So you're like, well, you want some bread, you want some sugar, whatever you want, but you don't. It's hard to accept. How could it be this item that my parents gave me? It's very hard to. So it's really dramatic what changes who they are. And when we took these things out, we have two totally different children that are so much calmer, so much happier. Right? And that's what really changed our behavior in our family. There's no way I would have been the driving force to change it. Because it's like what you're doing is you're really driving change in our kids. Right? That drives the change in us. So changing in the school systems, actually on a macro level, will have a huge impact on a national level, because what they've seen in different sectors, when they started introducing this education in the school systems, right, that's when people started to ask and wonder, and that's what actually changed, I think, even laws. So starting here, the kids start questioning and get an opportunity to say it's okay to